the highest court in the land did, Ford said that Kavanaugh pinned her to a bed on her back and groped her over her clothes, grinding his body against hers and clumsily attempting to pull off her one-piece bathing suit and the clothing she wore over it. When she tried to scream, she said he put his hand over her mouth, according to an account again that was previously published in the Washington Post. So that is some of the kind of horror that took place throughout Brett Kavanaugh's life, kind of a period of just excessive drunkenness, and privilege, too, was a big part of it. And just incredible. Like, I really get a sense of just absolute lawlessness, and not the type, when most people think lawlessness, they think of like old Western gunslinging type guy, but this is to me, it's a whole different type of lawlessness you can only get from going to Yale Law School, being incredibly wealthy, feeling privileged, fitting in with all those people, the very high class kind of thing, where I can just kick my feet up on the biggest desk in the room, the world is mine, I can do whatever I want, I can drink whenever I want, I can touch whatever girl I want, it doesn't matter because I am going places in life. Like, that's really kind of the sense that I get from his entire life story. And that kind of reality, I think, it's kind of emblematic of a lot of the kind of ruling class, I guess you could say, of America today. And that's why I think really the story resonates with a lot of people. And if you go back to this New York Times story here, there is a lot of that undertone. The headline, in fact, Brett Kavanaugh fit in with privileged kids. She did not. She's described as a top student in southwestern Connecticut. She studied hard, socialized little. She was raised Catholic and had a sheltered upbringing. In the summer, she worked at Carvel dishing ice cream, commuting in the $500 car that she bought with babysitting earnings. Like, he's not the guy going to Yale Law School, not the guy growing up in Maryland in a very nice neighborhood and all that stuff. Like, it's really it's that special aspect of a guy who just walks all over you. He knows he can do it. He knows he will be able to get away with it because he's going places in life, because he's comes from a privileged background. He can just stamp over you and just kind of rub you out in the sidewalk like your little ant or nuisance kind of bug to him. And that kind of sense, I think, it really twists up your stomach when you read about it, when you feel it, and it is such a devastating portrait of really his entire life and the legacy that he brings to the Supreme Court. So his father was a trade association executive, his mother was a prosecutor and later a judge, and they lived in Tony Bethesda, Maryland, owning a second home on Maryland's Eastern Shore. And of course, you may remember he went to Georgetown Prep. He was an avid sports fan and attended the annual teenage bacchanal called Beach Week, where the hookups and drinking were more important than the sand and the swimming. So, yeah, and that is Kavanaugh's background as described in this Sunday Review New York Times piece. Ramirez, on the other hand, this again also from the Times piece as well, grew up in a split-level ranch house in working-class Shelton, Connecticut, perhaps best known for producing the wiffle ball, and didn't drink before college, planned to really be, she was Catholic, obviously, so she planned to not get intimate until marriage. Her father, who is Puerto Rican, rose through the Southern New England Telephone Company and started as a cable splicer. Her mother, who was French, was a medical technician. So again, that kind of, like, that is such a different type of background. She worked her way hard into, she had to really, really grind to get to the position that she's in. I mean, I'm not saying Kavanaugh, I'm sure he worked hard, but he had every advantage along the way, whereas she like, the background she comes from, it's not normal for someone, it's not expected, it's not surprising for someone to get into that kind of position, being in Yale Law School and all that stuff. So that kind of puts in a perspective the two different backgrounds that are really at play here. And it, to me, really seems why. It makes sense that as she was being kind of preyed upon in this way, in this dorm room with Kavanaugh's junk flying in her face, It's just giving me just heebie-jeebies just even thinking about it. But when that, just as that scene's happening, like the article here describes people laughing. People say, "Oh, that's so funny! Oh, yo, look what Brett's doing to Deborah! Like, oh wow, that's crazy! Ha 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 ha!" But like the thing is, and I mean, I'm sure anyone, especially people closer to the age that these people are or people were, like they recognize it happening, and I think it's a real difference of the type of people that are normally in Yale Law School and Deborah Ramirez, who really, based on the system that we have and have had for a long time in this country, she wasn't supposed to, quote unquote, be there. Like she didn't fit in because she was just different from everybody else. They were all laughing. They all thought it was funny in, I guess, a really weird kind of dark way. And that's kind of just the culture of that kind of lifestyle. And it really, really is disturbing. Yeah, it's really kind of goes on in a pretty in-depth way to talk about her and her lifestyle, how she got into Yale, how she took pride in her parents' work ethic and enjoyed like camping trips, swimming in the above-ground pool, studious, making valedictorian at her Catholic elementary school and excelling at her Catholic high school, St. Joseph's. She took out loans to pay for Yale. She got work-study jobs on campus, serving food in the dining halls and cleaning dorm rooms before class reunions. That's not the same. She's just not the same. She comes from a different stratosphere. She comes from a different stratosphere than Brett Kavanaugh. A completely different. I mean, it's the same country. It's on the same East Coast, but it is so just amazingly different. The belief systems, the morals, the values, the ethics, like they are just worlds, I think, apart. And I mean, there are good people coming from both areas, like obviously, but like that kind of, like it's such an interesting and such really kind of a horrifying story. As you can imagine, all these people who grew up around the golf course and the tennis courts and the country clubs laughing as this big shot guy from Bethesda, Maryland, in a very, dad was an executive, comes up and just preys on sexually this working class girl who's going into college. It's like, yeah, I mean, she talks about how she tried to adapt to Yale socially, joined the cheerleading squad in her freshman year, sometimes positioned at the pinnacle of the pyramid. Pretty cool. She learned that although cheerleading was cool in high school, it didn't carry the same cachet at Yale. People called her Debbie Cheerleader, or Debbie Dining Hall, or would start to say that say Debbie Does, playing on the 1978 porn movie Debbie Does Dallas, but Ms. Ramirez didn't understand the reference. It's from the New York Times. She was very innocent coming to college, says Liz Swisher, who roomed with her for 3 years. I felt an obligation in freshman year to protect her. So, yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like, you're coming from such a completely different environment, and just to have guys like Brett Kavanaugh coming out there and just preying on people who are just that different, and that on that, like, that kind of, I don't really want to say higher position, just like they have had more experience, they've had more experience in life, they've done more kind of risque and bad things. Like, that's just, she was just such an easy mark, and leave it to a bully like Brett Kavanaugh for him to just see that immediately and start doing what he did. Fellow students made fun of the way she dropped her consonants when she spoke, but also ribbed her for not being fluent in Spanish. And they mocked her knockoff black and red Air Jordans. They even questioned her admission on the merits. Is it because you're Puerto Rican? Someone once asked her. My mom would have preferred me to go to a smaller college. Looking back at it, and she was right, Ramirez said. At Yale, they invite you to the game, but they never show you the rules or where the equipment is. And that is such a really interesting way of looking at it. Like, it's such an interesting take, and really interesting analogy, because it's for these people, it's just a game that people, they just tool around with, and you don't know the rules, you don't know what's going on, and it's just like there are people who knew and people who just don't. it's a different. I really feel like it's just a different game between quote unquote the predator and the prey, and it's really at a whole new level. It's really different, and that's just the kind of person that Brett Kavanaugh is. And Deborah Ramirez, probably like many other people who we don't even know about, just happen to be the victim on that side of things. Yeah, so it's really just an absolutely incredible and very, I think, illustrative situation of the world that we really are living in today. So, folks, we're switching gears now to a very big and interesting story that's playing out right now in Michigan. The UAW, or the United Auto Workers, it's the union, folks. It's going to be having a strike against the automotive giant GM. 50,000 workers will be heading to the picket lines tomorrow, or likely today, Monday the 16th, when you'll be listening to this. This will be a massive, massive operation, and we here at SWRN stand in complete solidarity with the workers as they go through with their first strike since 2007. And folks, I gotta be completely honest here. It is more than about time. Auto workers throughout the Midwest and really throughout the middle of the country, South as well, have seen their once vibrant communities sucked lifeless by mostly democratic free trade policies of people like Bill Clinton. NAFTA, TPP, and other devastating policies have sent American jobs to China, Mexico, and other East Asian countries that pay workers half of the already relatively meager wages that the average GM worker makes in America. The UAW wants GM to improve their wages, reopen their plants, add jobs at others, and close or narrow the difference between pay rates for new hires and veteran workers. So they just pretty much want to make a system where there can be more of a it's more kind of a welcoming system. People are able to get in, they're able to rise up in GM, and of course, GM, just even though they make pretty substantial profits already, they want their employees to pay a greater portion of their healthcare costs, which of course works great in today's economy, especially where there's a lot of these GM factories like Flint, Michigan, where the opioid epidemic is off the charts right now. Of course, they now have to pay more on healthcare costs if GM had their way. And they also want to increase workforce productivity and flexibility in factories, although I'd be willing to bet workplace productivity has gone up, at least over the past few years. Although the company has been earning substantial profits in North America, it has idled 3 plants in the United States as car sales slide and the overall demand for vehicles itself weakens. So that is the that last bit there was from the New York Times explaining some of the facts there about that matter. Talking about, by the way, the fact the company has been, again, earning pretty substantial profits, but still they are refusing. And it is a really wide difference. Really is a wide difference between some of the things that the union wants and some of the things that GM wants. And it really shows you the disconnect of what's going on and the way GM has pretty much turned Michigan into so much of a big, pretty much an outshoot of its operations here. And especially the old governor there, Rick Snyder, and the way he set up the way he set up Flint. And by the way, shout out, if you want to hear more about Michigan and GM and Rick Snyder, I highly, highly recommend Fahrenheit 11/9, which is Michael Moore's most recent movie, about how it talks a lot about Flint, Michigan. By the way, they're not really as much dealing with the opioid crisis over there in Flint, Michigan, but there still is, of course, a lot of problems that their opioid crisis is still a major problem in the area where there's a lot of GM factories. But they're also obviously dealing with the insane water crisis there. Flint still does not have clean water. Still does not have clean water. And there's a plant that they've been there's a plant over there that expressly got clean water from Lake Erie, that the old governor, Republican Governor Rick Snyder, set up there, because the water that they were getting from the Flint River was corroding the water parts. But this Rick Snyder was like, okay, we'll give you the good water that we used to use from Lake Erie, but we'll continue to give the rest of Flint the water from the Flint River. Yeah, just because that's just the smart thing to do. It's just the thing where you're not an insane psycho villain right out of a movie book and you want people to suffer. But again, those GM workers, they're really bearing the brunt of what is going